Have you ever wondered why some people can walk into a room, say something careless or offensive, and completely ruin your day while someone else in the same room doesn't even blink? Why do we get angry at certain words, behaviors, or people, while others walk free from our emotional judgment? The truth is disturbing but liberating. What angers you reveals you. What bothers you is a messenger, not a threat. And when you begin to truly understand the message, you reach a state of freedom where no one can disturb your inner peace again. Certainly. Here is the expanded speech, approx. 2,000 words for key points 1, 2, and 3 in the educational, motivational, and introspective tone, inspired by Carl Jung. The flow is continuous and intentionally does not conclude, as it will move naturally into the remaining key points. There is a silent war waged within the psyche of every human being, a war between the self we believe we must be and the self that we truly are. And in the battlefield of this unconscious conflict, anger is the explosion we feel when the pressure becomes unbearable. It is not merely an emotion aimed at another. It is a scream from the depths of the psyche, a flare rising from the unseen parts of ourselves that have long been repressed or denied. When someone says something that irritates you, when their words feel like a sharp blade across your identity, the tendency is to see them as the aggressor. But rarely do we stop to consider the true source of that agitation. Anger does not emerge from clarity, it emerges from fragmentation. We must ask ourselves, what is this emotion pointing toward within me? Is it really the tone of someone's voice or the words they chose? Or is it that they have unknowingly brushed against an invisible wound, one perhaps inflicted years ago, one we buried because it made us feel weak or ashamed? You see, what we repress does not disappear. It simply waits, often in the shadows of the unconscious, until the external world gives it permission to surface. And that permission comes not through gentle invitation, but through the people who irritate us the most. That is why emotional triggers are so powerful. They force us to confront what we would rather avoid. This anger, this irritation, is not a flaw in the other person. It is a flare from the shadow, signaling that something within us remains unlived, unacknowledged, or unloved. The person in front of us becomes a mirror, reflecting something hidden in ourselves that we cannot yet bear to face. And until we understand that this is a message from within, rather than a threat from without, we will continue to be ruled by external stimuli. We will mistake the messenger for the enemy. But the shadow is not the enemy. It is the part of the soul that was cast out when we learned, often unconsciously, that to be accepted we must amputate the parts of ourselves that others found unacceptable. This is why healing begins, not with changing the world, but with turning inward. The moment you begin to witness your anger without judgment is the moment it starts to reveal its secrets. And often, the secret is this: I am not angry because of what was said. I am angry because it touched a truth I have not reconciled. Perhaps it made you feel powerless, because deep down, you still carry the shame of powerlessness. Perhaps it made you feel unseen, because you've spent a lifetime trying to be visible in a world that taught you invisibility was safer. The shadow's cry for integration is not a moral failing. It is an invitation to return to wholeness. But the modern ego resists this truth. It does not want to believe that it is the source of its own suffering. It wants to blame, to cast judgment outward, to assign responsibility for its emotional life to others. Yet this is the very mechanism that keeps the soul fragmented. As long as you are at war with the outside world, you will remain estranged from your inner one. Every person who bothers you becomes a Kiev. Only you are willing to ask, what inside me remains unresolved? The complexity deepens when we understand that the human psyche is not a transparent entity. Much of it is constructed in layers, veils upon veils, until the true self is buried beneath accumulated expectations and learned behaviors. In this multi-layered architecture, projection becomes one of the most deceptive and powerful forces. What we fail to see or accept in ourselves, we begin to see everywhere else. We do not just live with our unresolved emotions, we externalize them. We assign them to others. Projection, then, is the unconscious strategy by which the mind defends itself from its own darkness. We place our fear, our envy, our rage, our inadequacy onto the faces of others, and then feel justified in our irritation toward them. But what happens when we realize that the qualities we find most intolerable in others are often the very ones we deny within ourselves? The answer is transformation. But it begins with the death of certainty. The certainty that you are the righteous one. The certainty that you have a right to be offended. The certainty that they are the problem. It is deeply humbling to recognize that we have made enemies of others simply because they reflect something unacknowledged in us. The arrogant man who scoffs at others' vanity may, in fact, despise his own need for attention. The woman who cannot tolerate emotional sensitivity in others may be hiding her own vulnerability under layers of emotional armor. What you project, you reject. And what you reject becomes your jail or dot. So the real question becomes, are you willing to stop projecting? Are you willing to claim what you have disowned? This is not a passive realization. It is a psychological labor, a conscious decision to interrupt the automatic process of judgment. And this begins with awareness. The next time you feel anger rise in your chest, pause. Ask yourself, what does this reaction say about me? Not them. Me. What part of me is being called to the surface? This simple act of inquiry breaks the spell of projection. It interrupts the habitual story that someone else is to blame for your discomfort. And in that space, something miraculous happens. The beginning of self-possession. You begin to call your energy back to yourself. You begin to realize that every judgment, every resentment, every irritation is an opportunity to reclaim a piece of your fragmented psyche. These moments no longer become causes for outrage, but invitations for integration. This brings us to a difficult but liberating truth. To be emotionally free, you must learn to love what you once hated, especially in yourself. What a radical idea. To sit with the traits you were taught to reject. To hold space for the anger, the pettiness, the insecurity, the fear, and say, you, too, are part of me. Not to indulge them, not to act them out, but to recognize them, and in doing so, to disarm them. The soul longs for wholeness, not perfection, and wholeness is the acceptance of complexity. You are not only your virtues, you are your contradictions, and until you welcome them into consciousness, they will rule you from the shadows. This is the paradox. The more you deny your inner darkness, the more power it has over your life. But the moment you turn toward it with compassion, it begins to lose its grip. You realize that you no longer need to fear or suppress the parts of you that feel unworthy or dangerous. You only need to understand them. That which you love, you do not need to control. And that which you understand, you no longer need to fear. So when you see in others something that causes revulsion or anger, pause and ask, what is this showing me about myself? You are not being punished by this encounter. You are being shown a key. Will you use it to unlock another hidden chamber of your own soul? This is not easy work. It requires vulnerability. It requires a willingness to break the ego's illusions, but it also opens the doorway to peace. Not the peace that comes from controlling your environment or avoiding difficult people, but the peace that arises when you no longer see others as threats to your inner order. When you have integrated your anger, you no longer fear being provoked. When you have faced your own shadow, you are no longer thrown off balance by someone else's. And perhaps the most beautiful part is this. The more you embrace the disowned parts of yourself, the more you begin to see others not as enemies or irritants, but as fellow travelers, each carrying their own burden, each struggling with their own projections, each walking their own path toward wholeness. Compassion grows where judgment once lived, and from that place, you begin to relate to the world not through reactivity, but through understanding. What you once thought was someone else's flaw, you now recognize as a shared human wound. What you once judged in others, you now see as a reflection of your own unloved self. And in this recognition, you find liberation not just from anger, but from the illusion of separation itself. Because to integrate the shadow is to remember that we are not isolated fragments, but interconnected reflections of the same inner struggle. To never be angry or bothered by anyone is not to suppress your emotions, but to understand their roots so deeply that nothing can shake your centeredness again. The next time someone tests your peace, may you remember, the test is not about them. It is about how much of yourself you have yet to claim. There is a profound misconception that to be calm is to be indifferent, that detachment is a form of emotional deadness. But this is a shallow and distorted understanding of what it means to be rooted in oneself. True emotional detachment does not arise from the absence of feeling, but from the maturity of having passed through feeling fully, painfully, consciously, and emerging on the other side with clarity. It is not coldness, but centeredness. It is not withdrawal, but wisdom. The person who has become undisturbed is not numb. They are awake in a way most are not. Their calm is not the silence of avoidance, but the stillness of depth. To live without being easily shaken by others is not a betrayal of compassion. It is, in fact, its highest form. Because when you are no longer governed by your own emotional turbulence, you can finally offer genuine presence. You can listen without defending. You can witness another's suffering without needing to fix it or run from it. And most importantly, you can act not from impulse, but from insight. Detachment, then, is the ability to hold space. Space for your own experience. Space for another's chaos. Space between stimulus and response. In that space lives the possibility of transformation. But this space is not given freely. It is earned through inner labor. The labor of watching your own reactions. The labor of questioning your assumptions. The labor of holding your anger without unleashing it. These are not the tasks of the passive observer, but of the active seeker. The seeker who knows that the world will never conform to their preferences, but who also knows that peace is not about control, it is about awareness. And when you are aware, deeply and consistently aware, something within you begins to change. You stop reaching outward for validation. You stop requiring others to behave a certain way for you to be okay. Your sense of self stops fluctuating with the moods of those around you. This is the emergence of the inner witness. That silent observer within, who sees without judging, who notices without clinging, who allows without resisting. The witness is not your personality. It is not your beliefs. It is not your fear. It is the deep center of your being, the part of you untouched by experience, yet capable of holding all experience. To live from this place is to live with serenity, not because life has stopped being difficult, but because you have stopped being unconscious in the face of difficulty. The journey toward this witness consciousness begins with the practice of self-observation, not in the mechanical sense of self-monitoring, but in the spiritual sense of awareness. Every time you are triggered, every time you feel the familiar pull of anger or irritation, you are given a gift. You are offered a mirror, not a mirror for judgment, but a mirror for reflection. In that mirror, you see your own patterns, your own wounds, your own illusions. You begin to see how often your reactions are not responses to the present moment, but echoes of the past. Old stories, old fears, old identities trying to protect themselves from extinction. But the more you observe, the more you realize you are not these stories. You are not the rage that rises, nor the resentment that lingers. You are not the shame, nor the pride. You are the one who sees them all. And the more you inhabit the seer, the less control the scene has over you. Anger loses its grip. Irritation loses its urgency. You begin to act from intention rather than reaction. This shift is not dramatic or sudden. It is subtle, gradual, unfolding in layers. But its impact is immense, because it is the difference between being a victim of your emotional life and being a conscious participant in your evolution. To observe without reacting is one of the most radical acts of self-sovereignty. It is not repression. Repression is unconscious. Observation is conscious. And consciousness is the only thing that can transmute emotion. When you see clearly, you are no longer at the mercy of the moment. You recognize that every trigger is an invitation to go deeper, an invitation to ask, what part of me is afraid? What belief is being challenged? What need is crying out? This inner inquiry leads to truth, and truth leads to healing. But healing, in the Jungian sense, is not about becoming unfeeling. It is about integrating the fragmented aspects of the self into a coherent whole. Integration requires honesty. It requires a willingness to see yourself not as you wish to be, but as you are. And it requires patience, the patience to sit with discomfort, to watch the storm pass without grabbing for shelter in blame or avoidance. In this practice, you begin to experience the true power of choice, the power to choose stillness over reactivity, the power to pause, the power to respond from your center rather than from your wounds. And in that response lies your freedom. Because the world will never stop offering you challenges. People will still disappoint. Words will still sting. But you will no longer be hostage to them. You will be anchored in a deeper truth, that no external force has authority over your inner state unless you surrender it. And when you cease to surrender that authority, you reclaim your power. The power not just to remain calm, but to transform pain into purpose. Because the final and perhaps most profound realization is that every emotional disturbance carries within it the seed of growth. The conflict you avoid is the very thing that contains your next breakthrough. The person who irritates you may be the catalyst for your next level of integration. They are not obstacles, they are mirrors. And every mirror, when used consciously, becomes a doorway. Conflict, then, is not the enemy. It is the teacher. But only if you approach it with the right eyes. The eyes of the unconscious see conflict as a threat. The eyes of the awakened see it as a revelation. What is being revealed is not the flaw in the other person. It is the unfinished business within you. Each time you are disturbed, you are shown a place within that still reacts, that still identifies, that still believes in the story of separation. And this is the crux of the inner work. To use external conflict as a map to internal truth. Imagine if every time you were provoked, instead of lashing out or collapsing inward, you paused and asked, what is this trying to teach me? Imagine if every difficult conversation became a portal into deeper self-knowledge. This is not idealism, is practice. And practice transforms. It turns life into a path of conscious evolution. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And begin asking, how can I grow through this? There is no bypass here. This is not about pretending to be unaffected. It is about becoming so deeply grounded in yourself that nothing can pull you out of your center. And that grounding comes from the work. The work of sitting in silence when you want to scream. The work of feeling your emotions without being consumed by them. The work of choosing presence over projection. Over time, this work becomes a way of being. And from that being, true transformation arises. You become the kind of person who does not need to defend your worth, because you have seen it for yourself. You do not need to win arguments, because you are no longer identified with the voice that fears being wrong. You no longer see people as enemies to be conquered, but as mirrors to be learned from. And even when they are cruel, even when they are unconscious, you remain still not out of superiority, but out of understanding. Because you have been there. You know what it is to act from pain, to lash out from fear. You have done the work of meeting those parts in yourself, and so you can offer others the grace you once needed. In this way, you become an alchemist of experience. You take irritation and turn it into insight. You take conflict and turn it into clarity. You take emotional chaos and turn it into centeredness. This is not a gift granted by fate. It is a capacity cultivated through discipline, reflection, and radical honesty. It is the path of the individuated self, the self that has become whole, not by eliminating the dark, but by integrating it. And in that wholeness, nothing disturbs you, because nothing is foreign to you. You have made peace with your inner world, and so the outer world no longer threatens your equilibrium. You do not need to escape discomfort, because discomfort has become your teacher. You do not need to silence others, because your peace is not dependent on their behavior. You are free not because life is easy, but because you have stopped running from its complexity. You have returned to yourself.